Welcome back to VQ Intel. Today we're going to be working on solving combined or sometimes called compound inequalities. Links to the worksheets that I'm working on are in the description below. Now, this is building off the work we did in the last video in the playlist where we talked about solving with sign charts. And we're going to be using sign charts to solve these inequalities. So what we first need to do is we sort of need to go through our 4 steps. And so we first have to ask what values of x make this expression 0. And so those are going to be 3 and -1. So we'll put those on there, and I'm going to label those as 0. Next, we ask what values make this undefined. Well, anything less than -1 is going to make this negative under the radical, and that is going to make it undefined. So that means I'm just going to mark this interval as undefined, as the empty set. So now I have to fill in these 2 intervals. So let's say I plug in 0. So 0 here is going to be a negative. 0 here is going to make that a positive. So that means this interval is negative. And then over here, this interval, if I plug in 4, that's plus. And 4 over here, that's plus, so that means this interval is positive. Now, what are we interested in? We're interested in the interval where it's less than 0. That is, the intervals where it's negative. So that means it's going to be this interval right here. -1 less than x less than 3, or if we use interval notation, we use parentheses -1, comma, 3 parentheses. So for the next one, same thing. We start with what makes it 0. And so here we have a ratio, so we look at the top. What makes the top 0? That's 2. What makes the bottom undefined? What makes the bottom 0, which makes it undefined? That's -3. So now we have 3 intervals that we need to fill in. Over here, if I plug in -4, that's a negative on top and a positive on bottom, because no matter what, it's going to be positive. So that's negative. Over here, if I plug in 0, that's a negative on top and a positive on bottom, so that's negative also. And then over here, this is, let's see, I plug a 3 on top, so that's a positive on top and a positive on bottom, so that is positive. Okay, now we want to know where's this less than 0 or equal to 0. So we have 2 intervals, this interval here and this interval here. But we can't include this point because undefined is not 0. So we have x is less than -3, or -3 less than x less than or equal to 2, because we do include 0. And so this is how we would write it with inequality notation. The way we would write it with interval notation would be like this: -∞ to -3, parentheses with the u, with the union, -3, comma 2, like that. So the next one, here we have 2 factors on top and 1 factor on the bottom. So what makes the top 0 will make the whole thing 0. That's going to be 2 and 5. Now what makes the bottom 0? Well, there are 2 things. What makes the bottom 0 is 3. That makes it undefined. I forgot to mark those as 0. But also, we have a radical. And anything less than 3 is going to make anything under the radical negative. So that means this whole thing right here is undefined. So the fact that 2 makes this 0 is overshadowed by the fact that 2 makes this undefined. And so that is going to win out. So that means we only have 2 intervals we need to test. This interval from 3 to 5, and from 5 and up. So if I plug in 4, I'm going to have negative for this factor, positive for this, because it's absolute value, it's always. And then for here, if I plug in 4, that's going to be positive. So negative times a positive over a positive is going to be negative. Now over here, if I plug in 6, let's see, plug in 6 here, that's positive. Plug in 6 here, that's absolute value. Plug in 6 here, that's positive. All right. So I want the interval where it's less than or equal to 0. So it's just going to be this interval, 3 less than x less than or equal to 5, because 5 does work. And the way we would write that with interval notation is going to be 3, so parentheses, 3, comma 5, bracket. And again, we don't include 2 because it makes it 0, but it's overshadowed by the fact that down here, if I plug in 2, that would make it 0 on the bottom, and thus undefined. So with this one, here, first we ask what makes it 0 on top. That's 1. Then, what makes it 0 on the bottom? That's going to be undefined. So that's -3, and that's 5. But we also have a radical. So that means anything less than 5 is going to make it radical. So that means all of this turns out to be undefined. Turns out not to work. So we only have one interval over here. So if I plug in 6, that's a positive on top, a positive on bottom, and a positive here. So that's positive. So what makes this whole thing greater than or equal to 0? Well, x is going to be greater than 5, or as an interval, 5, comma, infinity. Thanks for watching. The links to support this channel are down below, and remember, the best way to understand something is to do it.